All right, hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at topic C out of section 2. Now with 2C, we're looking at how do we distinguish the financial aspect of engaging a cloud service provider. So this is looking at how do we summarize the financial aspects of actually engaging a cloud provider. So touching up from the stuff that we looked at on Monday, today, we're just going to be focusing more on finances, and then I think D's looking at technical aspects as well. So when we're looking at expenditures, we have two aspects. We have both capital expenditures and operating expenditures. Now, when we're looking at capital expenditures, we're looking at how it basically represents the cost of a business and how it's able to endure the cost of like a land, building, hardware, and things like that. So they tend to be a long-term cost. What I would say is, if you want to think about it as an analogy, is imagine buying a house and you make like a hefty investment. So I know in the UK, you either have a 5 or 10% deposit when you're buying a property. Now, these are your long-term investments that will serve you for many years to come. So in similar kind of veins, the capital expenditures or CapEx represents the long-term assets like land, buildings, hardware that a business needs to invest in. Now, when we are looking at the type of capital expenditures and we're looking at it when it comes to IT, in the IT realm, think about capital expenditures as constructing a fully fledged data center for your business. So this would be like a building or your own house where you have an upfront cost for the servers, routers, and switches that will last a long time, but would require an ongoing maintenance. Now, one thing I will add is they might depreciate over time. So similar, if we're looking at houses with that example, they might depreciate in value over time because these
28, 2 and 8.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. So similar to like a house that might require maintenance and updates, they might depreciate in value over time. So these long-term IT assets will also depreciate, spreading their initial cost over multiple of years. Now, when we are looking at capital expenditure and the cloud, it's looking at costs related to IT investments, where businesses are investing heavily in traditional IT infrastructures. So an example would be like seasonal sales might require the use of a powerful web service for 3 months, and then servers that are underutilized for the remaining 9 months, they don't have to worry about that spending. So what I will say is that imagine now, instead of buying a house, you decide to rent an apartment. You're not responsible for the many long-term costs that is linked to that apartment because you pay a monthly rent, and you might do some maintenance costs depending on how long you stay within the accommodation. The thing is, cloud is similar to that model. So with cloud, you are renting the space in the online space. You're renting the cloud space, turning the hefty expense of capital expenditure into a recurring monthly fee or annual fee, which is the same as what we would see like as an operational cost. So instead of you spending a hefty amount because you are renting the cloud, you're not, creating the whole infrastructure yourself, you're now turning that infrastructure cost into an operational cost. Now, again, going back to the example of like seasonal scaling, consider a vacation home that you buy but only use over the summer, but for the rest of the year it's idle, right? Similar to that, businesses only buy powerful servers for peak times when we're looking at hardware, but these servers are underutilized during much of the years. Now, cloud services eliminates this inefficiency because it lets you rent more capacity only when you need it, rather than you actually paying for the whole thing. So because you're renting, and going back into the example of resource pulling, and I think when we're looking at the characteristics of cloud, the fact that you're only spending based on how much cloud usage that you're using. Now, this goes back into servers, routers, data center, capital expenditures. These are like the infrastructure costs. But with cloud, instead of having all of this, you are just renting the space in the cloud. So because of that, even though it would be traditionally seen as a capital expenditure, it's now being converted into an operating expense because you're only utilizing the number of cloud space that you use and for the time period that you use that cloud space. Now, when we're looking at operating expenditures or OpEx, it's basically looking at the house analogy that I talked about. Think about operational expenditures or OpEx as your monthly utility bills. So like your groceries, your groceries, your maintenance, your ongoing costs to keep your household running smoothly. These are reoccurring and these are shorter term expenses. So the difference, a great way to think about the difference between your capital expenditure and your operational expenditure is capital expenditure is you buying a house. Operational expenses you renting, because if you buy a house, although you are paying mortgage, it's a long-term investment. But with operational cost in the context of renting, it's a short-term investment. Now, when we are looking at kind of like the examples, you're looking at payroll, benefits, supplies, advertising. And then when you're looking at when it's in regards to like IT, it would be similar because you're looking at your monthly cost of electricity for your servers. You're looking at the salary for your IT staff. You're looking at the monthly fees for software licenses. So it's looking at, things around training, utility service agreements and things like that would be your operating expenditures in relation to IT. So when we're looking at operating expenditures in the cloud, these service model is kind of similar to a SaaS, right? So if you remember, SaaS is software as a service because it alters the cost structure. Why? Because most SaaS operate on a monthly or pay-as-you-go model or pay-as-you-go subscription, which will be more cost-effective than you having a traditional licensing, which is more of a longer-term investment. Now, with cloud services, they provide flexibility and efficiency. Why? Because of that measured services, which I talked about earlier, if we're looking at the characteristics of cloud and the elasticity as well. So operating expenditures, as you see here, you have payroll on one hand, you have utilities on one hand, and you have employee training. And I think a good way to kind of hone it is understanding that similar to renting an apartment, which involves paying a rent instead of buying the property outright, that's the same thing with subscription-based cost, which is what these kind of SaaS packages kind of operate on, because they let you pay a smaller fee each month. And instead of you buying the whole infrastructure, you only pay to use the service, and you pay the amount of service or the amount of cloud space that you use. Now, the benefits of this is that cloud offers elasticity and measured service. So similar to a flexible lease, which might allow you to upgrade to a larger accommodation. So let's say you are renting an apartment, after 1 year or 2 years, you decide to move to a bigger house. You have that flexibility. You can scale up the amount of space that you use. Similar, if we're looking at it in the context of business, you're able to scale your operation up, or scale, if we're looking at scale up, scale out, based on your real-time needs. So making your business more agile and also making it more cost effective. Now, a summary, because I know I've kind of put a lot of information, if we're looking at capital expenditure, is like buying a house. It's a long-term investment. If we're looking at operational expenditure or OpEx, it's an ongoing cost of living in that house, but like paying utility bills or paying the rent. Now, the cloud shifts many IT expenses from moving from a long-term investment, which in the past is seen as CapEx, to a more pay-as-you-go model, which is seen as operational expenditure, which is similar to renting an apartment or subscribing to a service. Now, hopefully through these analogies, we can see how cloud computing fundamentally has changed the landscape of IT, making it more flexible and cost effective for many businesses. So in the past, a lot of businesses will have had to pay a large sum and be more in the capital expenditure, where they invest in long-term in their IT structure. But now they're kind of focusing more on this operating expenditure, which means that it's kind of flexible, cost effective, and more of a subscription-based model. So that has, if you were looking at it historically, is the shift that has kind of happened with cloud. Cloud has changed the way businesses spend money and changed the way that they financially spend. So rather than buying things outright and paying for infrastructure, it's more of a renting, pay-as-you-go structure model. So now we're going to be looking at what is our fixed cost versus variable cost. Now, if we're looking at fixed costs, it represents the cost of like maintaining IT infrastructure. So going back into the examples used, which are servers, routers, and other hardware. Now with this one, the cost remains the same regardless of production. But I want to actually go deeper looking at fixed costs. So going back into the example of housing, imagine a mortgage or that you rent your house. It's a cost that remains the same. Whether you're home all day or you're traveling for a month, you're paying the same. I would say maybe with mortgage it's a little bit different because it does change yearly. But let's say if you're renting and you have a 2-year contract, for example, within that context, you have a fixed cost because whether you're in the house or not in the house or you travel for a month, you're still expected to pay your rent and the same type of cost. Similarly, fixed costs in businesses are similar. They don't change based on the level of goods or services that you produce. So when we're looking at examples of fixed costs, I think I've mentioned some here. You have your IT infrastructure. So that's the initial setup cost for your servers, your routers, your switches, and other hardware. When we're looking at software licenses, this often are either a one-time purchases or an annual subscription. Now, if we're also looking at the physical location, it's a physical space in which you're housing your IT hardware, essentially. Now, going back again with the key function or key definition of fixed costs is that these are costs that remain constant regardless of how much data you process and how much users access your service. Now, when we're looking at variable costs, these are costs that may change depending on production. So think of like your grocery bill, right? Let's say you have a guest over, your food expenses will go up because you are eating, you're buying more food for this guest. Now, let's say you decide, you don't have a guest and you're by yourself, your cost will go down. So basically your food expenses kind of changes based on if you're going out frequently, if you're staying home, if you have guests and things like that. It's a variable cost. And in businesses, variable costs behave the same because they change based on production level. Now, when we're looking at what variable cost in IT looks like, we're looking at three different characteristics. The first characteristic I'll say is electricity, for example. The more servers you run, the more power you consume. So the more electricity you use. The second variable cost that I would say is your bandwidth. Now, your bandwidth is when costs increases with higher data transfer rates. And finally is maintenance, right? More frequent upkeep might be required by increased usage, by peak periods within your company, and things like that. Now, a cloud migration may shift IT expenditures from a fixed model to more variable model because it's flexible. And going back into the characteristics of cloud that we talked about when we're looking at measured service and elasticity, it's why there has been a shift from more fixed cost to a more variable cost when we're looking at cloud migration. So just to kind of like talk a little bit about cloud migration, it's when a business moves its operation to the cloud. So there's often a shift from fixed cost to variable cost because instead of maintaining an expensive hardware, for example, or an expensive software, which can be a fixed cost, you pay for a cloud service based on your actual usage, which is a variable cost. Now, the benefits of a variable cost in cloud is that one, you have scalability. Why? Because it's easier to adapt based on the change in demand. Secondly, it's cost effective. Why? Because you only pay for what you actually use. And then the third one is agility. You're able to deploy newer services or scale up existing ones. And then finally is capital efficiency, which is you're able to reduce the need for upfront capital expenditure which allows the business to free up resources for other business needs as well. So when you're thinking about cloud migration and thinking about the benefits of the financial model going from more fixed to variable and from more capital expense to operational expense, think about these benefits: scalability, cost efficiency, agility, and capital efficiency. So we're now going to look at licensing models. So when we're looking at licensing models, sorry, did someone put their hands up or did I just miss that? Hi, Sasha.
Sorry, I don't really understand the difference between capital efficiency and cost efficiency.
You mean capital expenditure and operating expenditure?
No, sorry. But the benefits you're just talking about for cloud migration, there's two that I didn't understand the difference between.
Okay, so when I was, wait, let me go back. So which particular one? Because I gave 3 examples. I think the example that I gave were, go back. For fixed was scalability, cost efficiency, agility, and capital efficiency. So, okay, you're talking about cost efficiency and capital efficiency.
Yeah.
So with cost efficiency, you're only paying for what you actually use. So similar to like an electricity or PSU mobile phone, you only use the amount of credit that you have. So it's more of a PSU model. So it's efficient because you're not paying a fixed cost. Is kind of variable in the sense that you only pay for how much cloud space you use. Now, when we're looking at capital efficiency, it's talking about you don't have to pay for the infrastructure. You don't have to pay for the capital expenditure of actually creating a cloud. Because you're renting, you're freeing up resources for other business needs. So capital efficiency is kind of going back into the capital expenditure, which is all about long-term investments. So because you're not making long-term investments, it's more of a shorter-term investments. It's a lot cheaper. And because of that, you have more resources to allocate to other business needs. Does that make sense? So cost efficiency is focusing on the amount that you're paying. You're only paying for the amount that you're using. While capital efficiency is because you're not having an upfront capital expenditure, for example, buying a house, rather you're renting the space, it allows you to focus your resources on other business needs. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No worries. So going back to licensing model, when we talk about licensing, I would say that it's looking at the different ways in which software, we're buying software, we're using software, for example, in this case. So how we're using software. So there are different types. The 4 different types of perpetual license, subscription license, bring your own license, which is acronym BYOL, and then license manager. So I think the bring your own license is kind of funny because it reminds you of like if you have a house party, for example, bring your own drinks. You just need to change the D to L. It's kind of like an easy way to remember it. So when we talk about perpetual license, right, it's a permanent purchase of the right to use the software indefinitely, which means it's basically paying to use the software for life. And this is what the traditional licensing scheme was companies were having permanent purchase for the right to use a software. Now, if I want to put this as an analogy, imagine a car. Once you pay the full price, it's yours to keep forever, right? So similar to a perpetual license for software, it works in a similar way because you make a one-time payment and the software is yours to use forever. Now, because, it's a traditional model, you pay upfront and the software is yours. However, the issue is that once it's bought, it doesn't matter if the software is being used or sitting idle. You've paid it. So it's not really cost efficient because you don't really know the value, you don't even know if you've utilized the value of the particular software. And also it's not agile. It has a lack of agility. Why? Because adjusting the number of license or shifting to another software solution will be costly. Example that I gave last time was that a lot of software companies might have different products that you need to kind of like use in unison. So for example, I use the concept of an Apple, right? With your iPhone, you can connect it easily with your laptop, with your Apple Watch. Why? Because they're all from the same company and they all have kind of that user where you can kind of utilize all three. However, the issue is if you decide to get an Android phone, you won't be able to connect with your Apple Watch or with your Mac as easily. So because of that, it's going to be costly for you to have to decide to like maybe buy another Apple phone, for example. So it's not agile in that way. When we're now looking at subscription license is like the standard for cloud services. So think of like your Netflix subscription, right? You pay a monthly fee and you have access to their library. You can cancel and change your plan as needed. And because of that, I would say that subscription model is very much similar to subscription licenses for cloud. Why? Because of the flexible options to increase or decrease the number of licenses as needed, and that you may be billed either monthly or annually. So it's a shorter term investment than the perpetual license, which is kind of you pay up front and is more of a long-term investment. However, I will say that it can be more expensive for software with a very long lifespan. For example, it could be more expensive. Examples of this is Microsoft Office 365, Salesforce, QuickBooks Online. These are kind of like your standard subscription license that you kind of pay to use these services. Now, this BYOL is quite interesting, which is like bring your own license. And this is used when an organization already owns a license, right? So this is when a license is valid, whether the software is deployed on premises or in the cloud. So I would say, imagine bringing your own wine to a restaurant, or to a restaurant when you can bring your bottle from your own collection instead of buying from the restaurant. BYOL is similar because if the organization already owns the license, those licenses can often be either applied to on-premise or on the cloud. So there is versatility because you use a license you already own, whether your deployment is on-premise or on cloud. An example of this is Microsoft volume licensing. Why? Because it permits deployment of specific quantities of Windows servers, Microsoft SQL servers, Exchange, SharePoint, and Dynamics. It normally comes as a package. So because of that, you can kind of deploy this either on the cloud or on-premise. Now, the final one in this list is your license manager. So your license manager kind of acts as a steward, so keeping track of all the licenses to ensure that you're not breaching any terms. So think of a license. Hi, Antonio. Sorry, do you have anything to add?
No, I just had a question. So just it's interesting because this will probably answer my question, but just one stage back, just for everyone, I think would be useful. So if an organization brings their own licensing, who is then responsible for that license?
So oh, sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
No, it was just going off the end of my question, just updating and managing those licenses.
Oh, so yes, I think the license manager is the one who's going to be managing those licenses. But the organization will, so similar to the first one of perpetual license, in this case, the organization already buys the right to use the software indefinitely. So in that case, they can kind of, what do you call it? They already have like their own license. So it's just kind of focused on them deploying that either on premise or on the cloud. So in this case, like with Microsoft volume and license, it allows the deployment of specific quantities. So you can decide to have Microsoft 365 and other Microsoft tools like SharePoint, Exchange, and things like that, because it's more of like a package. I don't know if that makes sense, Antonio.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
So with license managers, license managers act as a steward, so keeping track of all your license. They ensure that you're not breaching any terms. So think of them like a librarian who ensures that books are properly checked out and returned. So when we're looking at compliance, it basically, how do we help organizations stay within the legal boundaries of software use? And an example of this would be like your AWS license manager. So it's a service to manage licenses across AWS and on-premise servers, so helping you stay compliant. Now, if I was going to go through all of them, it would be if we're looking at like a summary of all of them, it would be that perpetual licenses are like buying a car outright. It's a one-time purchase for indefinite use, but lacks versatility. A subscription license is like your Netflix subscription. They're flexible and they're typically standard in a cloud service. Your bring your own license allows you to utilize the licenses you already own, regardless of whether your software is deployed or not. And then a license manager is like an AWS license manager in regards to them assisting maintaining that compliance in license usage. And also, if we go back into what we discussed on Monday, when we're looking at the different kind of contracts that were utilized in regards to having service agreements and things like that, it's also ensuring that both parties are being compliant to those contracts and to those standards already set. So by understanding these various licensing models, you can have a better decision that is aligned with your organization's operational needs as well as financial considerations. So going back to contracts now. Contracts are all about, you have different parts. So you do have like your traditional agreements, which in the traditional IT settings, businesses have complete control over their on-premise resources, and they own the hardware and the software, and their contract is focused on maintenance and upgrades. While in cloud agreements, it's kind of within like the cloud paradigm, you have a control of resource shifts to the cloud service providers, so CSPs. So in regards to who actually deploys the resources, they're able to do that. So with the question on the chat, bring your own licenses like product keys. I wouldn't say that they are like product keys per se, because I would say product keys are like authentication methods that allows you to have access to a software. So I wouldn't say that it is like a product key, to answer your question, Sasha, on the chat. If we're going back to contracts, with cloud agreements, there is like the control of the resource shifts from traditional agreements, which tend to be the business, to now cloud service providers are now the ones who are expected to do those resource control. Now, with cloud agreements, contracts are generally focused on service levels, also focused on availability, security, and configuration, rather than the ownership of physical assets. If we are now looking at other elements, we have contract terms. So there are different contract terms that might be useful for you to understand. So the first one I would say is data ownership. So data ownership is all about who owns the data stored in the cloud. So this is a crucial aspect of any cloud contract, because it's like who owns the data that you're storing in the cloud. The next one is data security. So that is, how is your data protected? So this includes things like encryption, access control, and compliance with regulations such as GDPR, but also other regulations that your specific industry might need to adhere to as well. We then have intellectual property. So this is all about who owns the right to any new developments, configurations, or customizations as well. Who owns the rights to those things? You need to kind of have that defined within the contract. And then going back into what we discussed on Monday, when we're looking at service level agreements, so when we're looking at server levels, it's what level of service is guaranteed. And again, this is usually expressed within your service level agreement that you would have with the cloud provider. And then you have your service availability. So how often will the service be up and running? You know, when would be your up times, for example, and what are those guarantees? So let's say your business operates between a particular period, or you know that you have an uptime between, I don't know, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. That needs to be defined, because that's going to be looked at within the cloud contract. And then going back into disaster recovery and business continuity, which we've been talking about since last week and this week, is what are your contingency plans in case of a disaster, especially disasters that will affect either your data or your service availability as well. And then when we're looking at fees, is just what are the costs that is associated with what are the costs that are associated with the service, you know, the services or how they are structured. And then finally is termination, which is extremely important. Termination looks at what are the conditions under the contract that can be terminated by either of those parties. Now, even if, you know, many of us don't have like a legal background, this is a great way, especially if you're looking at a contract with a cloud provider, to kind of understand what the contract should entail, and especially that compliance aspect and governance of that. What does that look like as well? So additional contract considerations that you need to think about is that you need to negotiate your exit strategy, right? So always negotiate a clear path to retrieving your data if you decide to end the service. How are you going to have that data retrieval process? What does that look like? You also want to be able to think of your early exit fees. So this deals with, you know, being cautious of any penalties that you might incur by ending the services before. Oh, see a little echo. By ending the service before the contract terms end, for example. So ensuring that, you know, you don't have any penalties for ending the service before your contract terms expires, but also the right to audit as well. So the right to audit your CSP. So your CSP is your cloud service provider. So ensure that you have the authority to audit your cloud service provider, because that will also help you when you're thinking about third-party risk. Why? Because it's going to actually help you to have compliance with your contract terms, and also allows you to ensure that you have created all the mitigating steps for that data security. And then you want to check check the competition, right? So before signing, always compare terms with other service providers. Remember what I said on Monday, when with these kind of like different ways of trying to see different providers, is you're making sure that you're comparing the services from different cloud service providers. Why? Because you want to be able to have a leverage, but also context. You want to know which cloud service provider is going to be best suited for your organization. And then finally is scalability. So understanding how flexible the contract is in terms of scaling your resources either up or out. Now we're going to go into billing. So when we're looking at billing, most cloud contracts normally adopt, like I've said, a pay-as-you-go model or a pay-per-use model for billing. Why? Because this offers a greater flexibility than your traditional models. Now, when we're looking at billing for unused resources, it's important to know that you have to be aware of some resources, such as like your active virtual machines, which might incur charges even when not in use. Also, when we're looking at, for example, let's say a developer creates a test virtual machine, but forgets to shut it down. This would incur additional fees. And when we're looking at dashboards, most cloud service providers offers dashboard. So they allow you to have a real-time information of your current billing status. So you're able to control that a lot better. And as you can see from my screen here, see if I can zoom in a bit. This kind of shows an example here. You can see your monthly cost, as well as like your annual cost, and you're also seeing your usage. So your CPU usage, your disk usage, and your RAM usage as well. So you can kind of have a better overview of how much money that you're spending. And if you want to be able to scale down, you're able to understand areas in which you can do that as well. So going into the next topic, we're going to be looking at human capital. So human capital is all about kind of like a skill set shift, for example. So if we're looking at IT staff training, for example, is your cloud administration skills are not the same as an on-premise administration skills. And there's a reason for that, because there are specific areas of professional development that need to be considered. So I would say that in the transition of cloud computing, it's vital to understand that cloud administration skills are not interchangeable with traditional like physical administration skills. Why? Because there's a lot of protocols, security management and security measures, as well as administrative tasks that are quite unique to the cloud. So when we're looking at cloud security, for example, you need to be able to understand encryption. You need to be able to understand what access control is, and as well as compliance. When we're looking at cloud development, is you need to be familiar with cloud native development environments, as well as the tools that are utilized within these environments. Also, in the concept of DevOps, you need to have skills in regards to continuously looking at continuous integration and continuous delivery and automation, especially when we're talking about the features of the cloud, which is agility. And when we're looking at migration, is the administrator needs to have an expertise in moving applications and data to the cloud. And then finally, the administration is different because you're managing cloud resources, you're monitoring those resources, and you're also looking at the scalability of those cloud resources as well. Now, when it comes to standard employee training, software services or SaaS applications may have less predictable life cycle, right? Because companies might change their mind. For example, a company might decide to use Trello today and might decide not to use it maybe in 3 months' time if it's looking at its financial priorities. So because of that, when your organization decides to implement a new software version, training may be needed for these rapid changes, but there needs to be conversations around what is seen as a priority. Platform as a services or PaaS environments will also have a similar issue. And why? Because with SaaS applications, for example, because the software cycles is very like unpredictable, vendors decide when to roll out new updates as well as new features, and this may require or prompt an employee training. Now, with a PaaS environment, employers may also encounter rapid changes and will also need to adapt quickly. So because of that, training may be necessary to keep everyone up to speed. So an example here is a SaaS application provider. They release a new SaaS version on update, and then there needs to be a SaaS application trainer, which will deliver these training or new versions and updates to its end users. So you would see this in the form of software companies having webinars, creating groups, for example, forums where people can ask questions, or documentation page where they're able to kind of highlight how you can, utilize these SaaS or PaaS with the new updates that are there. It can look different depending on the platform, whether it's SaaS or PaaS as well. So a recap of everything that we have discussed today is that if we're looking at cost and expenses, capital expenditure represents a long-term physical asset cost. So cloud services can often reduce these, because with a cloud system is more of a kind of short-term investment rather than a long-term investment than what it used to be traditionally. Also, when we're looking at operating expenditures, it covers costs that are used to produce goods and services. So a cloud service may sometimes increase these operating expenditures. Now, when we're looking at licensing models, remember you have three major types, but I think there is three major types. So the first time is perpetual license, which is all about is a software that you can use indefinitely. You buy it once and then you can use it for life because you've purchased the rights, which tends to be a huge lump sum in regards to upfront costs. And then you have your subscription, which is, like I said, similar to like that of Netflix, where the license is managed on a monthly or annual basis in regards to how much you pay. And then bring your own license, which is volume licenses that can be used on premise or in the cloud. So for example, with that is me, let's say I already use Cloud 365, it's me just increasing the volume that I use with Microsoft, for example. And then finally, when we're looking at kind of license managers. So if we're looking at license managers, it's all about cost estimators, cloud service dashboards, utilizing license managers to monitor and manage these expenses as well. When we're looking at contracts, which is on the next page, the idea is that you always have to carefully read the fine print and negotiate carefully to protect your organization's interests. And remember the kind of key things that was said that you should look out for when you're looking at a contract, which is utilizing, is there a data, what's the data ownership, what's the data security, intellectual property, is that defined? What is your service level, your service availability, your disaster and recover, as well as business continuity within that contract, the fees and the termination. These are things that you need to think about, as well as reading the fine print to make sure that you fully know. So I'm seeing that Ufama has a question. Might be silly purchase. So if you purchase a subscription model, it can be used on premise too or only on the cloud. I would say that it depends, because subscription doesn't talk about on premise and on the cloud. It talks about the nature in which the cost is. Let me go back. Okay, back the opposite way. So when we're looking at subscription license, it's the style of the license. It's a flexible option because you're paying on a monthly or an annual basis. So it's kind of like more of a structure. Specifically, this is the standard for most cloud services. But if you do have, like, for example, some Microsoft tools can be used on premise, so you can use both. But when we're looking at subscription, it's the style of the license, rather than whether it can be used on premise or on the cloud. I hope that answered your question. And finally, when we're looking at the summary, recapping the points, I would say that subscription-based software may require additional user training. And that's something to think about as well, is that just because you are, you kind of have like your subscription, there might be other parts like updates and things like that. So you might need to, especially if you're working with a specific cloud service provider, is to see, do they have any webinars on like new features that they've updated? Are you looking at their documentations? Are you joining forums that allows you to be up to date on these changes? These are very important, so you keep yourself up to date. And also in regards to the administration, that traditional administrators are very much different from cloud administrators, because of those skills are very much different. And why? Because there are specific processes that cloud entails that a traditional administrator would need to be trained to be able to do those tasks and those procedures as well. So I have a bit of questions, but we're going to speed through because I'm also conscious of time, and this session is quite long in the amount of work that we have to do. So I wanted to ask, and feel free to put the answers in the chat, or if you want to say the answer, put your hands up. What are capital expenditures? I think some of you guys might have seen the answers when I was scrolling through. But can anyone tell me what capital expenditures are? Okay. If someone put hardware or servers, physical assets. Does anyone else want to give it a go? Kemi says capital expenditures that can be defined as a long-term expense. Sasha says long-term fixed cost for the business, so initial investment in the infrastructure. So you all had great answers. So the answer is basically what most people have said already. So the initial money put forward by investors when a business forms, so that initial kind of investment for the business, the cost of creating products and services, so including payroll, supplies, utilities, costs associated with a primary business location, and these tend to be separate from the cost of branch offices, and then the cost of physical assets such as servers, network devices, and end user workstations as well. So thank you everyone for giving it a go. And yes, I think Kemi said which could be hardware and server, pretty much. I think when thinking about capital expenditure, like I said, it's like buying a house outright. While if we're thinking about OpEx, it's more of renting. So the long-term, short-term investment is also a good way to kind of differentiate the two as well. So keyword, the cost of physical assets such as servers, networks, devices, and end users' workstation. So why might a capital expenditure be reduced with cloud deployment? Hey, Sade?
Hi, I just had a question about the first question you had.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the cost of creating products and service and stuff, I thought that would be operating expenditure as opposed to capital expenditure.
The cost of creating.
Yeah, so where it says including payroll, supplies, and utilities, wouldn't that be operating expenditure instead of capital, or is that?
So I think it's looking at more of long term. So your payroll would be a long-term investment. Certain
Right,
supplies
okay.
and utilities would be long term. So hence why.
Okay, all right, thank you.
No worries. And I think Ofama added saying cost efficient. I don't know if you're answering the next question. So why might capital expenditures be reduced with a cloud deployment? Does anyone want to give it a go? They become operational expenses. Let me read Ofama's one again. Cost efficient, capital efficient, reduction due to cost of physical assets, due to no longer needing physical assets such as hardware purchase to hold and maintain data. Kemi said because the cost of data can be eradicated. Elizabeth said the organization can reduce its investment on-premise hardware such as servers to a big extent. Kemi said centers, and Antonia said move out of DC. So the answer is, so it's kind of different variations of what's been said. So is that organizations don't need to heavily invest on-premise hardwares such as soft servers. Why? Because they are moving more into a cloud structure, which allows them to pay in a more monthly and cheaper cost than it would have in traditional expenditures or traditional use of capital expenditures as well. So is that conversion, if we were going back to see like previous stuff, what we talked about, the capital expenditure converting into operational expenditure when looking at cloud. Now I think we have two more, and then we're going to have a quick break. So what is operating expenditure? And we've spoken about this a while. So I'm just waiting to see people's answers because you guys should know this one. So what is operating expenditure or OpEx? So someone says day-to-day costs. Hawa says represents the day-to-day of a business cost of maintaining service. Okay. Any more? Here, you go, Antonio. Yeah. All right. Because of time, I'm gonna put the answer. So operational expenditure, OPEX, is the cost of physical assets such as servers, networks, devices, and end user workstations. So it is the ongoing cost. Keyword here is ongoing, day-to-day cost of producing goods and services. And it's a cloud licensing method, and there's a difference between fixed variable cost as well as a variable cost. So yes, like Chinua said, recurring expense. So that's a good way to think about OPEX, or operating expenditure. And then keyword is ongoing, which we kind of discussed. And the final one is, can anyone give me an example of an operating cost related to the cloud? Okay, Kemi says payrolls. Okay, everyone's using payrolls. I see Deborah as well saying payrolls. Also, I said cloud subscription. Anyone else? Okay, pay-as-you-go subscription. So all of you guys are right. So answers are varied. There's no set answer. But like what has already been discussed, it could be a SaaS subscription. It could be a pay-as-you-go uptime for your virtual machine, for instance, or your cloud storage. So it's anything that has that pay-as-you-go model or subscription model that's either monthly or annual. So those are going to be examples of operating cost. Why? Because it's ongoing cost of producing your goods and service. And Tony also said EC2 instance equals AWS. Thank you so much for that contribution as well. So I believe this is the final one, and then we'll go on a 5 minutes break. So how might IT administrators transition their knowledge from on-premise systems administration to cloud administration? So what type of training are we expecting to see? Or how might they transition their knowledge? Staff training, okay. What else? Okay, Sade says cloud service providers could provide a trainer for the staff. Ufama says training on cloud service and for cloud DevOps. Sasha says staying up to date by reading documentations on forums, and Ufama says webinars. And you guys are all right. So and Cinnamon says IT staff training. So answers can be varied, right? But I think the key element that everyone has included, which is great, is that it may include a classroom or online training by the cloud service provider, so CSP. I think, who said that? I think somebody, Sade, said that specifically. It could have third-party training vendors, e-learning solutions. I think Ufama said it, as well as Cinnamon and Susie as well. So, and Sasha as well. So you guys all gave great answers. And now we're going to go on a short break. We're not going to do this particular activity because of time, but I will say that for this question, in regards to the 3 different licensing models, there's perpetual, subscription, and bring your own license. But also ones that you guys might consider is subscription, community, as well as private or commercial. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about licensing models. Perpetual, subscription, and bring your own license are the main ones that are going to be considered for this exam. So probably focus on those 3, but just to kind of give a more general overview, private or commercial and communities also licensing models to also consider. Going back into, remember when we're looking at the cloud deployment models. So we're now going to go on a 5 minutes break. So I believe the time now is 7:02. So we'll be back here at 7:07 p.m. Look forward to seeing you guys soon. Hey everyone, I am back. So for this half of the session, I'm not going to share put my video, so apologies for that. But for the topic D, so we're now looking at topic D, report financial expenditures. I just want to confirm, can everyone hear me okay? I just need thumbs up.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we're looking at how do we report financial expenditures? So specifically in the exam, we're looking at 2.1, which is given a scenario, how do we use appropriate cloud assessment? And we're also looking at 3.3, which is all about given a scenario, how do we review and report on the financial expenditures related to cloud resources? So we're going to be looking at how do we calculate compute, storage, and also looking at network expenditures as well. So I want to start with, what do cloud service providers, which are CSPs, what do they bill for? So I would say that just like restaurants bills charges, which could be for starters, meal course, drinks, cloud service provider will bill you for 3 things. Now, the 3 things that they'll be billing you for is for compute, which is here. And compute is how basically it covers the processor time. It also covers the RAM as well as the licensing. So those are going to be your compute cost. Then when we're looking at storage, as discussed last week, it's going to involve the quantity of data stored and the speed at which it is assessed. So looking at cloud storage essentially. And then we're going to be looking at network. So that's going to be the third bill charge that it's going to give you. And the network basically is all around the infrastructure device, the software, the maintenance, and the connectivity as well. So when we're looking at the next one, which is compute cost, what is compute cost, and what makes up a compute cost? So a compute cost is looking at your processor time, your RAM, and your licensing, right? When we're looking at its processor time, think of it like an hourly wage that you pay for a worker's time. The more time your application takes up from the CPU, the higher the cost you would have to pay. When we're looking at RAM, imagine this as the size of your worker's desk, right? The more desk space or RAM you use, the more you will pay. And then when we're looking at licensing, it's like a membership fee, right? Let's say you're paying a membership fee for a professional organization. It gives you certain privileges or tools based on the level of licensing that you have. So you would notice that most SaaS have like a bronze, gold, silver package, right? And depending on how much you pay, dictates how much privileges or how much benefits you're going to entail, similar with licensing. And then when we look at operating systems and licensing, the examples that I would give is Linux. So Linux is free to use, and it's basically like riding a bike you already own. And then Windows servers require a paid license. So it's similar to like licensing a car, for example. Now, when we're looking at storage costs is basically the quantity and speed at which it must be accessed. So going back to what we discussed last week, hot storage and cold storage. When we're looking at hot storage, think of it as having a file on your office desk, which you can easily access, right? You only pay a premium for the convenience of that. A cold storage is, imagine storing a file in a basement archive. It is cheaper, but it takes longer to access. So because you're able to access it faster, it would be called like a hot storage. But because, it's in a basement archive, you'd have to go down and search through the different files. It's cheaper, but it's going to take you longer to access because the procedure is a lot longer than that of a hot storage. Now, when we are looking at billing factors, you are billed based on the amount of space of your files, like the amount of space your files takes up within the cloud and how quickly you need to access those files. So it's very much like renting a storage space, but depending on whether it's hot or cold, that depends on how fast you access the specific file. So when we're looking at network, it deals with infrastructure, devices, so your routers and your switches. It deals with your maintenance, connectivity, etc. So right here in the middle, we have our CSP pricing for cloud service offering. And as you can see, it's taking into consideration storage cost, compute cost, network cost, and utility cost as well. So it's taking into consideration all those 4 things that allows them to then say, okay, this is what your bill would be to use the cloud. So final thing actually that I want to say with network cost is that what's included is often infrastructure devices. So similar to, let's say you're paying road maintenance for a smoother ride, you also pay for devices such as like your routers and switches. And then also another part of a network cost is software. So imagine paying for a GPS service for better navigation. Network software enhances the performance, especially the cloud performance as well. And then when we're looking at maintenance, it's like regularly, servicing your car to avoid a breakdown. Similarly, network maintenance ensures a smooth operation within the cloud. And the final one is connectivity. So think of this as like your toll and gas costs, right, for a car's journey. So this deals with bandwidth. It deals with your data transfer, which will also have their own cost as well. And all of these will fall under your network costs. So your infrastructure devices, your software, your maintenance, connectivity are all under network costs. Now moving forward to reporting. So reporting deals with virtual machines. So I would say like you have 2 parts. You have your virtual machine instances, which are like a good analogy would be like your standard rental cars. And then you have your reserved instances, which is like leasing your car for a long period at a discount. And then you have your spot instances, which is like, imagine these as like your last minute deals, car deals that would otherwise sit unused. So because of that, you get a deal for it. So that's kind of like a good way to think about these 3 different instances. But to go into deeper, looking at your virtual instances, think of VM instance as like I said, a rentable car. So you choose the engine power, which in this case would be, in the case of cloud and what we're looking at would be your processors. You are also thinking of like the trunk space, the space, the boot space of the car. In this case, you're thinking of your storage within the cloud. And then you're also thinking about your cabin comfort within the car. And this would be like your RAM. And you're billed accordingly to these 3 things: storage, processor, and your RAM. Now, I would say that most infrastructure as a service deployments are virtual machines, and virtual machines consume compute, storage, and network capacity. A virtual machine instance is a hardware, and it profiles these resources, like I said, processor, RAM, speed, and storage. And then you're billed for each of these instances, 1, 2, 3, depending on its specifications. Okay, just checking to see because I can't see the chat anymore. And then this is a virtual machine instant dashboard, in case you're wondering what it looks like. So as you can see, the dashboard, you have dashboard here, admin, messages, additional service on the left. But what are we seeing when we look at virtual machines? We can see the 2 VMs being used, which are Red Hat, in this case, Red Hat and Windows virtual machine. At 3030, you can see the usage. So here you can see the amount of CPU used. You can see the amount of disk space used, and you can see the RAM. So going back into what I said, processor, RAM, storage. So the disk is the storage, the CPU is the processor, and then we have the RAM, which is pretty much the same, so that you're not confused when you're thinking about how does it relate to what we just talked about. And then here you can already see like current and target, right size, and you can also see the amounts, the cost of each as well is so it's consistent. So here is $31.25 in this case. So when we are, if you guys can see the screen anymore, go back. Okay. When we are looking at the second part, which is your reserved instances. So reserved instances are VM hardware profiles your organization commits to at a discounted rate. So I would say a good analogy to think about this, for those who are not technical, is that thinking of it like a long-term car lease. You agree to keep it for a while, so you get a discount for it. Now, a reserved instance utilization is predictable and steady, and is useful for both the organization and also the cloud service provider. Then you have your spot instances, which are unused virtual machine hardware profiles that are made available to your organization at a significant discount. So I would say like a good way to think about it is, imagine you found a very cheap last minute rental car deal for like a quick day trip. Now, spot instances are the cloud computing equivalent. Why? Because they are perfect for short and intense usage scenarios. So remember, like the example, like a e-commerce on Black Friday, for example, they're going to expect a higher usage. So because of that, they might decide to use a spot instance because they know that that period is going to be very busy for them. So it's useful for flexible and elastic compute needs. Now, going back, you can see the elastic, which goes back into what we talked about when we looked at the 5 characteristics of cloud. So this is where it kind of plays out, where that characteristic plays out, just to kind of bring what we discussed last week into today's conversation as well. So when we're looking at license types and costs, I would say that, we have Microsoft Windows servers, which often require a paid license, so whether perpetual or volume. And then you also have Red Hat Linux, which requires a paid subscription. And then you have Ubuntu and other Linux distributions that do not require a paid license. Now, I will say that, think of these software licenses like different types of restaurants, meal deals, for example. So all of them are inclusive, but there are different parts. So if we're looking at the ones that's quite expensive, that would be like your Windows server. But there are cheaper options like Red Hat Linux. And then there are also some that are bring your own food or free, which would be your Ubuntu or Linux, which are free to use basically. So if we're looking at it at different type, Windows is probably like quite pricey. Red Hat Linux is a little cheaper, and then Ubuntu and Linux are free or have that kind of bring your own, basically free version of it. Then you have your cloud service providers, and they often pass the cost of these licensed organizations. Now, cloud service providers or CSPs also have licensed managers within their company that helps the organization to track their licensing. So I think this goes back to Antonia's question as to who's managing. So in this case, the cloud service provider would be the ones managing these licenses because they have their managers to help you to kind of track the licensing. But some companies, depending on resources and financial capability, can also have their own in-house license manager that would liaise with the cloud service provider licensing manager as well. So it all depends with the company and the size, how that scenario would play out. So now looking at chargebacks. What are chargebacks? Does anyone know before I go into it? Because I know I've been talking quite a lot. Does anyone know what chargebacks might be? Take a guess. Does anyone want to give it a go? Penalties. Automated penalties. Okay. Anyone else? All right. I'm going to say what it is. So a chargeback function is like splitting a restaurant bill amongst friends, right? Each person pays for what they ordered. Now, in a business context, each department or each unit is billed only for the cloud IT services it consumes. So this allows you to segment where within a larger organization is what will probably be the best scenario used for this context. Within a large organization, each department will be billed for the cloud IT services that it consumes. So that's pretty much so it's like splitting the bill, but splitting the bill depending on the different departments and units within a organization. Now, why is this relevant to cloud computing? It is relevant because this model is tightly aligned. It's tightly aligned with cloud computing characteristics. So if we go back to the characteristics, and I know I keep mentioning it, but it's only because for you to understand how we are building our knowledge with looking at like the financial elements and things like that, we really have to understand the 5 characteristics listed by NIST, which I discussed in the first session. So it is relevant to cloud computing because of the characteristic of a measured service. Why? Because just as a meter measures your household electricity consumption, cloud services can accurately meter each department's usage of those resources. So let's say you are in charge and you're trying to cut down costs, you're able to see which department is incurring the highest cost. So it's a way of you to kind of manage that as well. So I think to kind of look at this example infographic used here, you have your cloud service provider, the CSP service, build service is then passed on to organization. The organization then distributes chargebacks to business units. So an example here is like your developer team, your sales team, your marketing team, each will have their own budget, right? Because you're able to split their own bill. And because it's measured service, you can see how much each department is actually spending, which is great for a strategic element when you're trying to kind of say, okay, we know that in this particular time, before, let's say, use an example of Black Friday, before Black Friday actually occurs, the marketing might have a bigger budget because they're going to require a lot more service because they're going to be doing a lot more marketing before it actually occurs. Then the developer team or the IT team might then during Black Friday have a bigger budget because the website is going to be utilized a lot more. So things like that are kind of like a great way for you to understand chargebacks and what they mean. So when we're looking at resource tagging, so resource tagging is basically it's like putting name tags on each dish of like a potluck, right? Or when you go to like events, sometimes you have to put tag that has your name as a way of you networking with other people. So it's kind of like the same concept with resource tagging. It helps identify which department, project, or owner is consuming which cloud resource. So it's basically the benefits of this is that it reports consumption in order to generate chargebacks. So it's easier to understand which resources is consumed by whom. And it's also easier to understand what resources are not being consumed and should therefore be retired. So it's very resource tagging and chargebacks are kind of intertwined in how they work in regards to the process. And it's important because it allows the cloud manager to be, especially if they're like working more in a business context, to be more strategic in the allocation of resources. Now, I will say the benefits of this is 2 things. One, it allows you to have clear consumption reports. It allows you to precisely report what is being used and by whom. And the second benefit is your resource retirement. So it makes it easier to identify underutilized or idle resources that could be shut down. So you'd notice if a certain department, is not using the service, so you can then reduce the amount of budget that you then allocate to that particular department. Now, when we're looking at cloud maintenance, what is involved? I would say think of cloud maintenance like servicing your car, right? You have to change the oil, which would be like in the case of cloud would be your firm updates, rotating your towers, which will be in the case of cloud, your software updates, or even changing parts, which in the cloud context would be your hardware upgrades, for example. So it's all about how do you maintain your cloud? So, what are your firm updates? What are your software updates? What are your security hot fixes? What are your hardware upgrades? And what are your hardware troubleshooting or replacement? Now, when you are offloading these tasks to service providers, I would say one of the benefits of cloud computing is that many of these tasks can be outsourced to the cloud service provider. So in the case of the car that I used, it's very much similar to, leasing a car with a full service and maintenance included within the price. So that's the same kind of process for those who have cars. That's like a good analogy to think about. Now, if we move on into hardware life cycle management, what does it mean and what does it track? So it tracks three things, which is hardware, infrastructure. It also tracks the depreciation value and then the hardware reliability. So when we're looking at the infrastructure hardware, it's like keeping a logbook of your car. So you're tracking all the components, and you're also tracking their statuses as well. When we're looking at the depreciation value, is similar to how cars lose value over time. And then when we're looking at hardware reliability, it's like noting how often your car breaks down or needs repairs. So in the case of a cloud, it would be like, in the case of hardware, it would be like, keeping a logbook on the hardware, on the components and the statuses of the components. When we're looking at infrastructure, it's looking at the depreciation of the hardware, because there's going to be newer models that are going to be created, especially when we're looking at hardware as a physical entity. And then that reliability, how often does that hardware break down or needs to be maintained or needs to be fixed? All these things contributes to what the hardware lifecycle management system would look like. Those are components that you would need to think about. Now, when we're kind of recapping everything that we have learnt today, key things to note is that your CPS, resource metering, your cloud service provider will keep tabs on your consumption, much like a utility company. For example, when I said, your electricity meter, you can kind of see how much electricity that you've used and things like that. Similar, your cloud service provider will keep tabs on your consumption. Also, instances type. There are three types of instances. There's your standard virtual machines, and think of this like your everyday commuter cars. Then you have your reserved instances. So think of these as like you leasing a car with predictable costs. And then you have your spot instances, which is similar to you having a last minute rental car deal. So those are a good way to kind of differentiate between those instances type. And then you have your chargeback, right? So your chargeback, this helps you ensure that each department only pays for what it actually uses. And it's similar to the point of what I said, like, you go to a birthday party, everybody has a good time, and at the end they split the bill and you sit down kind of saying, okay, what did you order? Similar structure. Each department, there's a detailed account of how much each department has spent. And then when we are looking at resource targeting, which is like relating to cloud resources, to the business units on consuming them, resource tagging helps us to associate cost with the responsible parties. So it's similar to putting a name tag on dishes within like a potluck, for example. Now, I would say that understanding chargebacks and resource tagging helps you to have a better financial governance, right? Because you're able to see how much is being spent at each department. And because of that, there is a clearer accountability. And because of a clearer accountability, there is more effective utilization of cloud resources, which is very, very important. Now, going back, we're now going to have some question times. So I believe that there's only 5 questions that we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to close today's session. So I think some people already saw the answer, but what is an instance? Does anyone want to answer in the chat, or they want to say it? Okay, someone says penalties. Oh no, I think I missed that one earlier. VM, virtual machine. Sasha said a live running machine / server. Everyone says a virtual machine. Lesson says a virtual machine. And Antonia says a hardware profile. Okay. What is the answer? So for everyone who said a virtual machine, you are right. I think also I would say like an instance is a virtual machine that is allocated for the purpose, for a purpose. So it's similar to, so I think my brain, I think everyone was right as well as Antonio as well with the hardware profile. So it is both in the sense that an instance is a virtual machine that is allocated for a purpose. So it has an allocated hardware such as like a processor time. It has a memory, storage, and all operating systems such as like the Red Hat, enterprise Linux or like a Windows server. So that's a great way to think about what an instance is. So staying on the topic of an instance, how does a reserved instance relate to cost? And remember the analogies that I was using. Does anyone want to let me know? I'm looking at the chat. If someone's raising their hand, feel free to speak.
It's like renting a car at a discount. I think that's the analogy used.
Okay.
Or reserve.
No, I mean, I think it's a good attempt. I don't want to give the answer yet. I'm just trying to see what everyone's has said. But thank you so much for your contribution, Ufama. And I've seen that 3 people have now put up. Cinnamon says virtual server. Blessing says predictable cost. Cassie says reserve the hardware profiles that require a longer term credit commitment. And then Ufama said lease car at a discount. So what is the answer? So a reserved instance are usually less expensive because the organization commits to use the instance for a set period of time. So I think Ufma, you are right. You are right in kind of like the discount aspect, but it's for the discount would be more for the spot instance. So the reserved instance is looking at it at a set time. So it's so you have the you can go back. So we have 3 types. So you have the longer where you just buy the car outright, then you have where you leased it. So the reserved one will be the lease example. Oh, actually, yeah, at a discount. So yeah, you were right. Sorry. I was thinking of the rental car deal for a shorter amount of time. So the reserved instance are usually less expensive because the organization commits to use the instance for a set period of time. So again, using that example of lease. So Sasha said like a gym membership is cheaper because you pay 6 months instead of one. Essentially, yes, you use it for a certain amount of time. It's not a long-term investment, it's more of like a shorter term, but it's for a set time. I think Chidori said it can be deleted and created when needed. Exactly. And then your spot instance is like for a very, very short amount of time. Those would be the example for that. Oh, I think I gave the answer for the spot instance, but I would like to see everyone's thoughts. So what is a spot instance? Go ahead, Afoma.
So I just wanted to go with the gym reference. I think the spot instance would be like you have a membership for a certain time in the day. So you can have like a membership that is for like between 12 and 2. And you get that at a much reduced cost than a membership that you can use all day. But I guess it's more like leasing rather than a membership. So it's even, yeah.
Okay. I don't think it's not like leasing. I think it's more like so you know how like leasing is
Wait, so sorry. Is this the one where they basically give you, if someone isn't using their spot, then they can give it to you? Um,
yeah.
So that because the CSP would rather use the resource, so they'd rather give it to someone else at a very low discount, but you don't know when it's going to be given to you, like you can't really predict.
I think you got half of it. I think in regards to it's like unused resources, but it's made at a discount. So for example, if you go to a website like Last Minute Hotels, for example, those hotels are much cheaper because they are unused, especially if like you have like a particular time in the year where hotels may not have as much traffic. So because of that, they lower their prices because they have unused rooms. So because of that, you have a discount. So because of that, I think a couple of people have put in the chat, Basayo said unused virtual machine hardware profiles. And Antonia also, I like her example, unused resources made available at a discount. So it's very much last. This is when you're renting a car. Let's say you have a short trip, so you're just utilizing discount. You've gotten a good car deal because they haven't really been able to rent a lot of cars, so they're able to give you a good discount. So like that. How I said profiles that are unused by CPS made available at a discounted price, essentially, yes. So an instance that may be used on demand at a much lower cost to take advantage of unused compute resources made available by CSP. So essentially like that. So the next one, what are chargebacks? Does anyone want to answer these one? Does anyone want to give a clue? If I'm going to say splitting segments of usage/resources. Deborah said different departments paying for the service. Yes, everyone's on the right track. Does anyone else want to give it a go before I say the answer? Okay. So what are chargebacks? Chargebacks are capital expenditures. Is an internal billing to business units for IT resources consumed. So it's credits issued by cloud service providers in the event of a downtime or other service level agreement violations, and also requests for quotes will also apply to this. So I think going back to Deborah's point, it is the kind of allocation of resources. Like I said, it's like splitting going out for a birthday and splitting bills within friend and everybody saying how much they spent at the restaurant. So similar is the expenditure for each department and how that contributes to the overall cost for the company. So but a great way to think about it is capital expenditure, because it's a long-term investment, although the structure is more operational because it's either annually or monthly, depending on the kind of agreements between the company and the cloud service provider. And again, keyword here is that internal billing to a business unit for IT resources consumed. So that's the answer. And this week we're going to have a reflection questions for us to discuss next week. So I would advise everyone to take a look. Please write it down. Also, do you guys want me to write down the reflective questions on the Geneva app? Would that also be helpful? Or is everyone happy to just write it down now? Let me know in the chat. Okay. So it is, do you believe your organization is already taking steps to move IT expenditures from capital expenditures to operating expenditures? And number 2 is, does your organization intend to implement chargebacks for cloud services that are consumed by business units? I will also put this in the Geneva app. I'll probably do it after this call. And yeah, we'll probably go through these next week. I might put it as a discussion for everyone to discuss within groups and then share, and then we can kind of spend about 10 to 20 minutes focused on the reflexive questions before going into section 3. But that is all for today. Thank you, everyone. Does anyone have any questions before we close today's session? Because I know we've closed a bit early today.
I do actually. Sorry. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see who.
Deborah.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi. Just a quick one. I just wondered, like, from your experience, like when we're talking about the chargebacks, what department does typically pays more? Just out of interest. I'm just thinking, like, when you say like different departments are paying for what they use, but just generally, like, I'm just curious, like from experience, what department usually have more demand? Is it like a like is it like HR or IT? I just wondered.
I think most time it would be IT, but it depends again on the industry. And sorry guys, I just remembered something, but I'll finish answering your question, Deborah, and then I'll make a point at the end. It's mostly the IT team, but depending on the nature of the industry. So for example, if it's e-commerce, other elements might like take place, like with marketing and other stuff like that. If it's NHS and health, for example, the different departments are going to the clinical departments and research departments might use more. So it really depends on the industry. That then signifies how much of those kind of like serve space would be used in the cloud, if that makes sense, Deborah. Okay. I think I said there might be spikes in the air as well. Yes, I just remembered, guys, I am not covering the session next week. So what I will say is, if you guys can actually put your answers on the forum as a way for us to have a conversation on the forum, and then I'll be able to kind of like share inputs. Antonia is going to be taking Monday's session, so I'm not going to be here on Monday. So the session's probably going to look different. So with the reflective questions, I'm going to put in the Geneva app, and if we can all contribute to the answers on the platform, that would be great. So I will close the session. But before I close the session, I don't know, Antonia, do you want to say anything?
No, today was a great session. I will try my best on Monday. yeah, if you do have any questions beforehand, please let me know. The resources are available, so do come to the sessions prepared. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Perfect. Sending, can't wait for you guys to have a great session on Monday. Shade, I see you have your hands up.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you said already, but who with the reflective questions, are we who are we? Like, what's our job role?
So sticking with the same role as a cloud architect.
Okay, great. Okay,
A cloud
thank you.
architect or cloud business analyst is mostly kind of how these questions are structured for.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Deborah, I don't know. I know you have your mic on. Do you still have another question?
No, I'm okay.
Well, thank you all for coming today. Today was a good session. I know that I need to upload the mentoring and this, but it will probably be on the platform by tomorrow. That's a promise, and I'll definitely put the reflective questions for us to have conversations on the platform. So wishing everyone a great evening, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.